Hey guys, my name is Phillip Toney. I'm a graduate student at Clemson University in the Wildlife and Fish Biology program. And today I'm going to be talking with you a little bit about the relationship of indigenous peoples and the natural resources around them, mostly focusing on wildlife and the land on which they're living. So we're going to cover a variety of topics. There's going to be some other things that we'll cover in some sort of depth throughout this presentation, but really I want to narrow it down to kind of four main topics or four main ideas that we're going to cover. Those ideas are going to be, the first one is going to be what is traditional ecological knowledge, or I'll sometimes refer to it as TEK throughout this presentation. So we'll talk about a little bit about what that is. The second one is going to be where are indigenous people now and where were they before? The third thing we're going to look at is what is the cultural importance of wildlife for indigenous people, and part of that is also going to be what is the importance of the land that they live on. And then the last one here is what is cultural-based conflict, and then we're going to look at a few examples of that, some of which are pretty modern. So we'll look at what exactly cultural-based conflict is, but then again looking at some specific examples and how those things essentially have worked out over the years here. Before I get into the actual information, I want to do a quick pre-quiz. You're going to see this quiz again at the end, so I'm not really going to spend any time going over anything right now. I'm just going to give you a second here as I read through it to kind of see the questions. And these should be things that by the end of this presentation you'd be able to answer. So the first question is going to be true or false: the population of Native Americans has drastically decreased since the beginning of the 1900s due to disease, mistreatment by, and warfare with European settlers, and a lack of resources available. The second question is going to be how does the indigenous view of land or wildlife differ from that of the European settlers? And then the third one there, give two examples of practices which modern Native Americans still participate in that could cause cultural-based conflicts. And again, I'm not really going to spend any more amount of time on this slide. So if you're actually wanting to try to do the pre-quiz and put some answers down to see if you were correct, you'll be able to pause this video, but I'm going to go ahead and move on to that next slide. So just to set the scene a little bit before we really get into the meat of this presentation, it is important to note that Native Americans have been using the land and the wildlife within it for thousands of years. And because of that, they really have essentially the first idea of what we now call traditional ecological knowledge, or TEK, which I'll explain more on the next slide. But a lot of that comes from the fact that not only do they respect the land that they're on and have a deeper connection than what a lot of us are typically used to, but it's because of what they're getting from the land. Every part of their life essentially was coming from the ecology in which they lived. So, they were hunting the game that lived within that land, but they were also using things like the grasses, the roots, the plants, the berries, the nuts, the trees for essentially all aspects of their life. Of course, food. When you think about like some of the plants, the berries, the nuts, of course they were using those for food, but they're also using a lot of those things for medications, for jewelries, for trade goods, and some of those things for structures. So of course, trees is an easy example of that, but even some of those grasses or plants would be incorporated into the structures in which they lived. And then even the game. So, we look at some of the Western Plains Indians who used teepee style structures. A lot of those were made out of animal hides or animal skins. And so, again, just that deep rooted connection kind of with the ecological world in which they live gave them this traditional ecological knowledge. So what is that? What is TEK? Traditional ecological knowledge explains that connection between the indigenous people and the world in which they live. So they understood not only what they could get from the environment in which they lived, but they also understood that they had a connection with it. So if we, do certain things, it's going to have either a positive or negative impact on this environment in which we're living. Some of those ideas were pretty simple. So the toxicity of certain plants or the life cycle of those plants, pretty easy things to understand. Somebody eats a plant and it's toxic. Enough people do that, it becomes pretty clear that that's not a plant that you should eat. That's a pretty easy one. But they started understanding some more complex ideas, such as the migration patterns of animals. Certain Native American tribes were, stayed in one area. So they were essentially farmers, and they weren't migrating with those animals. But there were certainly tribes that did migrate or did move, nomadic tribes that moved with these animal migrations. So understanding that concept that, the buffalo only stay in this area for so long before they move on is, as simple as it seems to us now, is a pretty complex idea. Or how wildfire can be rejuvenatory for the land that it happens on. They understood that concept and they used it for their purposes, and we'll talk a little bit more about that later. But they understand from the land those connections, and that gives them what we call that traditional ecological knowledge, or those experiences giving them the ability to understand and make decisions based off of that understanding. So this food for thought down at the bottom, just to give you, a little bit of something to think about here. We have Native American tribes all throughout what now would be the United States. So using, the current geography, the Aleuts and the Inuits in Alaska would have been dealing with long, harsh, cold winters, while the Navajo and the Pueblo in the American Southwest would have lived in a very dry, warm climate. So their traditional ecological knowledge would be very different, but they both have it. So this key theme or concept of TEK still exists within almost every Native American tribe. It just may be that their experiences and their understanding of certain things are going to be different based off of where they're living. And you could, continue to make comparisons for certain tribes. So the Cherokee and the Seminoles, who live in what now would be the southeastern United States, their understanding and their traditional ecological knowledge is going to be different from the Pawnee and the Sioux, who are living in the Great Plains and the Dakotas. And so, again, big thing to get out of this is they all carry with them this traditional ecological knowledge, because they all understand the areas that they're living in, the land, what that land and how that land can change the way that they do things or the way that they live. That concept essentially is traditional ecological knowledge. So one of the other big questions that I mentioned at the beginning there, or key concepts, was about where the natives are now and where they were then. And so, I've kind of made it easy here on this first slide just to get a quick glance of where they were then and where they are now. The left map there is showing you all of the different tribes that existed in what is North America. So this is going to show you both the U.S. and the Canadian and some other outlying territory there. The right map, of course, is just a map of the U.S., but it still gives you an idea of how much that land has shrunk. So you look at what is the U.S. there on the left map. The entire thing is taken up by Native American tribes, various Native American tribes on certain, sections of the map there, kind of not owning, and that's a concept we're going to talk about. They don't own that land, but kind of in control of that area, I guess, for lack of better words. The right map there is going to show you what the current American Indian reservation map looks like. So those little red patches there, those are current Indian reservations or tribal jurisdictions. You can see how much that shrunk. But to do a little bit more justice to that idea, we're going to look at a couple other maps here. So we'll look at this one, and then the one on page 8 I think really drives it home. But this map is going to show you, starting there in 1783, and really the data set here is starting in 1776, but there's no difference between 1776 and 1783. So we start with 1783. There's no acreage, no land taken from the natives yet at that point. The entire map is blue, showing native homelands. Once you hit 1856 there, you've only covered a span of about 70 years there, and almost half, basically, of that map is now gone. You can also see they've already started to set up reservations as early as 1856, and they've already taken over 715 million acres worth of land from what would have been native lands before that. You move down there to 1862, you can tell the map is starting to dwindle a little bit more. You've got a few more reservations there towards the middle of the map. And then especially that last map, you can see how much acreage was really taken from the natives. And you can also see that essentially there are no blue lands now, which would be the Indian homelands. They've all been forced onto these reservations almost. There's very few blue left on that map. And then you can think back to the last slide or go back to in the video to that last slide, slide 6. And that's going to show you that current map, or this next page is going to show you a map that winds up essentially the same of what our current modern day reservation situation looks like. But I think this map, or this series of maps, is good to see just how much acreage was really taken. And then this one, and I'll let this play through a couple times as I talk, it starts and you can see it just pushing westward, and then ending here on this next one in the present Indian reservations. So, of course, I don't suspect that you can read any of those, but you can see at the beginning there, late 1700s, essentially the whole United States is covered by a population of Native Americans living throughout the entire country, and then now being pushed into these very, very small little sections of what's left on the map at the end of this clip here. So I'm gonna let it finish one more time here. And right here you can see that's the present day Indian reservation. So a huge chunk of area has been taken from those people. So why did the native population decline so much, and why did that amount of land that they had decline so much? There are dozens, if not hundreds, of answers for that question, but we're going to look at just a couple here. And we're also not going to go super in depth with any of these, but I do just want to give you a little bit of an idea of what led to them being forced off of this land. So this first idea here in the top left that we're going to look at is manifest destiny. If you're not familiar with manifest destiny, essentially it's the idea of the European settlers who came, that they were destined by God to go westward and to conquer that land, and to take that land for themselves. And again, that was not just a belief, but they really believed that was a religiously based thing that they were supposed to do. They really believed that God wanted them on that land and to take that land for themselves. So the middle picture here just kind of shows the general idea of them being forced off that land. Manifest destiny is a part of that. Another part of that is going to be your top right picture there, legislation like the Indian Removal Act, and there's several other pieces of legislation I'm going to mention here. So, they were dealing with a lot of different government decisions and a lot of different legislation that just kept pushing them west. So the Indian Removal Act is an example of that. The Dawes Act, which is an example of that. The Homestead Act is an example of that. So, the Homestead Act, kind of a part of Manifest Destiny. Basically, the Homestead Act was them saying, hey, there's cheap land out west, and selling it to these European settlers. They're saying, hey, go take this cheap land, go farm it, and create a good life for yourself out west. And of course, a lot of people were interested in that, and so a lot of people took them up on that. Well, what happened to the natives that were already on that land? They were forced off of it. The Dawes Act is kind of not 100% literally, but almost a second half of that, where it seemed, helpful to the natives on the surface of it, because it was them saying kind of the same thing. Hey, here's this land we're going to give you if you go out west. But they were just pushing them further west, and they were taking the land that they were leaving for themselves, from that. So the Dawes Act looks good at the very beginning, but you quickly come to realize that it was really just meant to push them further off their land and further west. And one thing we're going to cover here in a minute that was kind of ironic about the Dawes Act is Native Americans didn't believe in the traditional idea of land ownership. So the idea that the government created this act, and they had people trying to sell Native Americans on this idea of, going and owning land out west and farming it. Most of them didn't really even believe in the idea of owning that land anyways. So it really wasn't what it appeared to be in the beginning. And then, of course, the wars with the settlers, and there's a depiction of Custer there on the bottom left, which, is a popular one that a lot of people know about. And then there, also on the bottom, is the spread of disease. That's actually going to be one of the biggest reasons why the native population declined so much. So yes, warfare led to a lot of deaths. Yes, pushing them further west and forcing them off their land for things like the Indian Removal Act or Manifest Destiny. A lot of people died during that time, but a huge number of Native Americans died because of the spread of disease when Western settlers got here. So, you've got this long list of diseases that they brought with them that the natives weren't used to, like smallpox and typhus and measles and influenza, malaria, tuberculosis, cholera. The list goes on and on and on. And so the natives take a massive hit when the Western settlers first get here, or the European settlers, simply because their population was being decimated by diseases that they had no sort of immunity to. And that's going to be the biggest reason why that native population declines so much. The land declining is more so because of those legislative acts and because of forcing them off of their land further and further west. Native populations, this one's a little bit tricky. And I say that because between the 16 and the 1800s, and of course earlier than the 1600s, there's not a great number that anybody can agree on for how many Native Americans there were before Western settlers or Western explorers got here. So you start looking at, Columbus coming in the 1400s, the people that came after him in the 15 and 1600s. There's not great numbers, and there's a lot of disparity and disagreement on what that number is. So it's not that you can't have a conversation about that. And it's not to say that there aren't numbers out there that are being thrown around. The point is, some of those numbers that are being thrown around are as low as 200,000 for North America, which most people agree is dramatically low, and highly unlikely. But then you have numbers as high as 18 to 20 million, which seems to be probably a little high. And so nobody can really agree on what number to go with. And so we're going to kind of ignore that part of it, as far as, an official number. And we're going to look at 1900 on. And this is one of those questions, if you remember from the very beginning. So as many Native Americans as there were that were killed throughout the 16 and 1800s, the population actually starts rising and rising pretty dramatically from 1900 on. So you can look at this graph and you can see in 1900 there's about 200,000 or 250,000 Native Americans living in the United States. By 2010, you have over 5 million who are self-identifying as Native Americans. And now that number has gone even higher. Why is that? And so these bubbles kind of discuss different ideas of why that Native population increased in the last 120 years. So over time, of course, living conditions got better. We have advances in medicine. Life extends because of those things. That's going to be a small part of it. Legislation and laws being designed to protect Indigenous people. Of course, it's not going to hurt. It's going to help with the numbers. A lack of warfare or devastating events, so you don't have things like the Trail of Tears again, or these American Indian wars between colonists and the natives. Again, that's going to help with the numbers not going down, so it's going to help with the population increase over time. But really, the two that I want to point out that are a big reason why that population has increased so much in the last 120 years. One is going to be that there's more tribes becoming federally recognized. So tribes that had existed before but weren't officially recognized by the U.S. government have since gone through the process to become federally recognized, and because of that, their numbers count now. That's going to be a pretty good chunk of people right there. The last one is going to be that more people identify as Native American. Because again, this is talking about self-identification. So when people are marking down essentially on paper what they are, more people in recent history are identifying as Native American or part Native American, and that's going to bolster that number as well. So again, despite all of the negatives and the losses that we talked about there for a few slides, the number since 1900 to now has actually gone up pretty steadily and by quite a bit. The next few slides, we're going to talk about the views of natives. I'll look a little bit of some of their worldviews, but really I want to focus on their land and wildlife views. So what were the views of indigenous people on land compared to what European settlers would be? So indigenous people, they saw themselves basically as a part of the land. They had great respect for it. They believed that they kind of live in harmony with it. Whereas Europeans, they have a little bit less regard for the land. It's and that's kind of a broad statement. Maybe it's not fair. That wouldn't be everybody. But typically a European viewpoint is going to be that they're going to bend the land to their will and they're going to conquer that land. And we'll talk a little bit more about that as well. Indigenous people also have no sense of ownership of land. And so they don't believe that a person can really own land. The closest they really get to that is believing that somebody who's on that land has the right to farm on it or hunt on it, but they don't actually believe that you can own that land. Whereas Europeans have a firm belief in land ownership, and buying and selling land is a regular typical practice. When it comes to wildlife, indigenous people really believe that a lot of wildlife is deeply rooted in their culture, and almost to a spiritual connection. So they really revere and respect wildlife, and they include it in a lot of their dances, songs, prayers, rituals. It's a huge part of their culture and a huge part of who they are. And then the other thing I want to bring up about wildlife, because we're going to be talking about some of the Native American hunting practices here in a bit, it's important to remember that Native Americans typically use pretty much all of the animal when they harvest it. So they're using the bone, the skin, the fat, the meat, furs, all of those kinds of things serve a purpose for them. So they really make the most out of those resources. Europeans, on the other hand, they're using animals primarily for two purposes. They're either eating it, or they're using it for working, something like, an ox or a horse. They don't really typically have any sort of spiritual or deep connection to those animals. Of course, we have some of our domesticated animals that we're closely attached to, but we don't really have a spiritual connection to the, the wildlife as a universal subject. And then a lot of times we're pretty wasteful with animals, so they would only harvest certain parts and leave a lot of it to waste. As far as views on the world, Indigenous people, they're going to view themselves a lot more as a larger or a part of the larger ecosystem, or a part of that communal community that they're within. And because of that, they're going to have more respect for that natural world that they're within. Europeans, on the other hand, they kind of see themselves, we throw out terms like tamers or conquerors of the world they live in a lot. And there's a reason for that, because that's more of what their mindset and their viewpoint is. They're much more individually minded, and again, much more controlling or conquering of the land or the wildlife on it. The last big concept I want to cover here quickly is cultural-based conflict. Cultural-based conflict is exactly what it sounds like. So it's these challenges that come up between different groups based on their beliefs, or what their culture is, and so because of that, they'll have conflicts or disagreements, because their two viewpoints don't match up based on what their cultural understanding of that practice is. And so we're going to look at some modern examples between natives and some different groups like biologists and hunters, to see what that looks like. So in Yakima, Washington, you've got the Yakima tribe and recreational hunters. They weren't agreeing because of the elk numbers. So recreational hunters were afraid that they weren't going to be able to hunt elk, because the Yakima tribe normally went on these large elk hunts. And sometimes those big game tags can be hard for people to get. Sometimes it's even on like a lottery system. And so the hunters were, pretty upset with the fact that this tribe is just given the right to go hunt these elk, and don't have to have tags and things like that. Essentially on that one, biologists assured everybody that the elk population was healthy enough to sustain that type of hunting. The Canadian and Alaskan Arctic, the Inuit people that live there, they've been hunting polar bears, seals, and whales for hundreds or thousands of years. And so you have a very sustainable, you have a very traditional hunting practice there that they've been doing for a very long time. Modern biologists, though, are concerned about some of those species because they're endangered. So you look at polar bears, there's not a lot of polar bears left in the grand scheme of things. And so some of these biologists are concerned about these practices continuing. And even with that one, even though it is an endangered animal, the government has actually allowed that practice to continue. In Arizona, with the Hopi tribe, you've got the collection and euthanization of eaglets, or baby eagles. The National Park System was actually the one that tried to step in on that one, to protect them and say that they shouldn't be able to go on their land and do that. And the Department of the Interior came in and said that as long as it was within the bounds and the areas that were agreed upon, they could actually continue to do that, because a lot of tribes have rituals that revolve around eagles. And then in northwestern Washington, you've got the Maka tribe, very similar to the Aleut one that I gave, or the Inuit one with the whales and seals and polar bears. They also hunt whales there, and again, same concern about these endangered species or low numbered species, whether it's still a good practice to allow that. And then in South Dakota, the Lakota tribe regularly has these cultural burnings, where they're burning large areas of grass and land. And, fire suppressing colonizers were against that idea, feeling like they were doing a lot of damage. Now we actually realize that, burning and forest fires and things like that can have benefits as long as they're controlled. So my concluding thoughts would be, even though these lifestyles and beliefs and perspectives of Native Americans differ from ours, there's certainly things that we can understand from them, and it kind of goes back to that traditional ecological knowledge. And it's important that we respect and understand what those beliefs are. I want to allow you to pause there and read that if you'd like to, but to try to keep this under half an hour. There's your post quiz again. And then here is my works cited.